Good evening, everybody. My name is Antonia Wunderlich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, I would like to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the British-German Association is a charity that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to support public education about Germany in the UK, so we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter. Tonight, we have the great honour of welcoming Katja Hoyer and Giles MacDonogh to a discussion on Katja's new book, Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918. Katja Hoyer is a German-British historian specialising in modern German history. She was born in what was at the time East Germany and read history at the Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, where she graduated with a master-level degree with distinction. She's a member of the Royal Historical Society and has written for History Today, BBC History Extra and The Spectator, among other history outlets. Katja has also worked with TV presenter Dan Snow for History Hit and collaborated on a variety of podcasts. Giles MacDonogh is also a historian, as well as a food, wine and travel writer. He's the author of 15 books, including biographies of Frederick the Great, The Last Kaiser, histories of Berlin and Prussia, and a best-selling book on the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. MacDonogh has written for major newspapers such as the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Times, and FT Deutschland. Katja's debut, Blood and Iron, has been described by critics as the best biography of the Second Reich in years, as splendidly lucid and readable, and as packed with detail and illuminating insights. It is a vivid and compelling account of the German Empire, which makes for an excellent lockdown read. Please do support your local bookshops if they do delivery, or you can order the book on the Waterstones website. I will add the link to the book in the chat. There we go. So before handing over to Katja, a quick note on the technology. There will be a Q&A session after the discussion, and the Q&A will be conducted via the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please note that we will not be using the chat function for this event, but the Q&A button. So if you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions, and please feel free to do so over the course of the event. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Katja.
Thank you. Just see if I can share my screen. Here we go. And the video back on. There we go. So thank you for that lovely introduction. So on that note, let's dive straight in. So the main reason really why I wanted to write this book in the anniversary year of 1871, so it's 150 years this year, since the beginning of modern Germany, if you will, was to set the record straight a little bit on this. I feel both in Germany and in other countries as well, the Second Reich has often been seen as almost as a prelude to the First World War, and then even further into the history that followed it, so the Nazi period and the Holocaust as well. And I think it deserves to be seen in its own right, as a distinct period, as an attempt to set up a Germany that wasn't headed straight for sort of war and catastrophe. So what I'm trying to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is outline some of those points why I think that this period is a distinct period and deserves a somewhat more balanced account. So I go back a little bit, quite a bit, which I do in the book as well, and just give you a brief outline into the sort of emergence of the Second Reich. If you look at sort of pre-Napoleonic times, before Napoleon invaded the German lands, there was really this kind of really messy conglomerate of German-speaking states. There were over 400 of them, loosely bound together under the Holy Roman Empire, or under this kind of structure that was the Holy Roman Empire, which was really very loose. So these individual political entities were duchies, some were sort of states, some were individual kingdoms. So it's a complete mess basically. And there was certainly no widespread sentiment that these were all kind of connected via some sort of sense of Germanness. And that's really only changed with Napoleon's arrival. So somewhat ironically, and you see this theme repeatedly, It's actually the threat by the French that molds kind of Germanness and German identity in its early phase, which is also why I think the empire was quite troubled from the beginnings, as you'll see in a minute. But even at that point, there are already those two elements here. There is this kind of Prussian and militaristic side to it. Perhaps to some extent still identifiable via its ruler at that point, Friedrich Wilhelm III, who saw himself as an absolute ruler, and there was certainly not a sense of kind of modernism or democracy that was very kind of widespread at this point in time. But on the flip side, the forces that he summons to try and fight off Napoleon in the liberation wars already have elements of liberalism in them, most notably the so-called Lützow volunteers, or the Lützow Freikorps, who you can see there on the screen. I singled those out because their colors, so the black uniforms together with the elements of red and the brass gold buttons, will later form the tricolor, the German colors, and they go back to these Freikorps units that sort of rally together behind the Prussian king to fight off the French. And that's a theme that you'll see kind of throughout basically in the German nation building process, but it's not entirely a militaristic one. So these Freikorps are voluntary troops. They fight basically for a sense of fatherland for the first time, if you will. And out of that later emerges a fairly liberal movement to form a German state that is actually opposed by most of the German-speaking aristocracy at that point. So already an element of dualism here, rather than a straightforward kind of history of militarism and nationalism as we understand it now. So when Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo in 1815, the structures that he had formed strangely form the basis of a more unified Germany already. So you had these 400 states previously before Napoleon invaded. He makes 39 states out of that for purposes of administration and control. And those 39 states are largely upheld in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna when the map of Europe is redrawn. German nationalists that had come out of the Lützow volunteers and other Freikorps are bitterly disappointed. They are basically thinking at that stage, as early as 1815, a somewhat more unified construct should have come out of the liberation wars. But that doesn't happen. What does happen, though, is that Prussia gains this territory here in the Rhineland, and that's a really, really important factor in this dualism between Prussia and Austria, who are the two foremost German states at that point. I think Austria, when they agreed to that, somewhat underestimated the effect that this would have on Prussia. So they, in their minds, they were always annoyed about, you know, what they saw as like the pesky Belgians over here constantly causing trouble in the border regions. And it was Austrian troops who had to defend this over here. And, you know, Prussia kind of steps into that, and the Austrians think, oh, brilliant, we don't have to bother with that anymore. A similar thinking actually emerges from the British perspective as well. They see Prussia as a new kind of stabilizing force in Europe. And so both of those kind of interest groups are happy for Prussia to have this territory, and neither anticipated the effect that this would have. When you think the amount of natural resources in this rural region here, coal, iron ore, you know, they're all kind of the building blocks really of the industrial revolution, which hadn't really kicked off properly in the German-speaking lands before. And Prussia is now effectively given the means to press ahead and push ahead of what is still at that point a very agrarian and very traditional Austria. And so that's basically where that conflict between the two begins to escalate or diverge at that stage in 1815. All of these 39 states are loosely held together by what is known as a German Confederation, whose only purpose is they've got their parliament here in Frankfurt. And the only purpose really of that is to have a common sort of foreign policy, as it were, so largely war and defense orientated. But other than that, in theory, they should be higher than the individual states, but in practice, they're very rarely able to push anything through that the individual states don't want. Move forward a bit to 1848, and once again, you have this kind of typical combination that I'm trying to point out between a very liberal movement. So in this case now it's a nationalist movement. So people are out on the streets wanting a unified Germany under a kind of fairly liberal constitution to limit the power of the monarchs. But at the same time, this is suppressed by a very staunch response from the elites who, particularly after the uprisings are crushed, spent years and years cracking down on intellectuals, on socialists, on liberals, driving many out of the country. So this is where this kind of famous 48er generation turns up in America, of Germans who have fled the German lands because of the persecution that follows this. So this already sets up a pattern of fairly strong sort of liberal movements and democratic movements. You can see the German flag being waved there. The Deutschlandlied, the German anthem still today, originates from this conflict. And on the flip side, you've got the elites opposing this. Actually, the Prussian king at that point, Friedrich Wilhelm III, puts on a bizarre spectacle. And initially, he's actually pretending to be on side with the protesters. So when this escalates in Berlin, he drapes himself in the German flag, so in the tricolor flag, gets on horse and rides along the protesters in Berlin, who are all a bit bemused what the king's doing. Only a few days later to completely broke back on this after the protests had kind of calmed down a little bit and looked less dangerous, and then the sort of crackdown began. The Frankfurt Parliament actually at this point offers Wilhelm, the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm, sorry, the Prussian king, the German crown. They say to him, we can put an end to this by creating a Germany of which you would be the Kaiser. And Friedrich Wilhelm turns this down and says he doesn't want the crown that comes from the gutter. And this is an actual quote. So you can already see this kind of snobbery coming from above and the fear to lose power to the people. He also said he doesn't want a piece of paper, as he phrased it, between himself and his people. So completely opposed to the idea of having a constitution and a constitutional framework. And thus basically unification doesn't happen at this point. Fast forward a bit, and this man comes onto the scene. Otto von Bismarck emerges as a very powerful speaker and very forceful individual, shall we say, with his personality, and is made, once Friedrich Wilhelm III is dead and the fourth is dead, his brother comes onto the throne, Wilhelm I, who will also be Wilhelm I of Germany from 1871 onwards. And he appoints Bismarck as minister president because he's struggling with his own parliament in Prussia. So in parliament, you've got a group of liberal politicians sat there, very, very powerful, already very vocal at this point, who are trying to prevent military reforms that the Prussian king is trying to put in place. And it's in that context that Bismarck says his famous speech, which also titles my book, where he says to Parliament, not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by blood and iron. What he's basically saying, and this is in the context of those military reforms, is if Prussia is to be more powerful and bigger and extend its kind of reaches into the German lands, we will need blood and iron, i.e. war, to do that. Just talking about it isn't going to be good enough. We saw that. He actually says that. I shortened down the quote a bit. He says that was the great mistake, as he phrases it, of 1848, that it was words and bluster. He says that we'll need blood and iron. And sure enough, he triggers a series of wars against Austria and Denmark, in reverse order, Denmark and Austria, and ultimately France, to unite the German lands. And that's effectively rekindling some of that spirit that we've seen in the Napoleonic Wars, where kind of this idea that Germany needs to rally together against a foreign enemy is triggered. I've got this map up here because I want to point out that the southern states were very, very difficult to get on board, and you still see a sense of that sort of separatism and the sense of being different from the rest of Germany, I would argue, till today. And they were only convinced that they needed to fight with Prussia because it was against, seemingly against a French aggression, basically, with Bismarck having triggered the Franco-Prussian War, so that France attacked, and that was important. So it's this sort of defensive nationalism, I would say, that brings the southern states on board. There's Napoleon III after the Battle of Sedan, 1870, with Napoleon looking somewhat hopeless there next to Bismarck, and at that point, of course, this ends his reign as well, and France becomes a republic. Wilhelm, meanwhile, Wilhelm I, who is the King of Prussia, is most upset about this whole thing. He's really not keen to become the German Kaiser. And I'm just pointing this out again because this narrative of militarism often sees it as kind of like a Prussian conquest of the German lands under, the sort of Prussian elite who, supposedly wanted all of that. Wilhelm does not kind of fancy the Kaiser crown one bit. He famously breaks into tears on the eve of the declaration of the German Empire, so on the 17th of January 1871, actually cries, sobs, and says to Bismarck, "We're carrying Prussia to the grave tomorrow. What have you done? This is all your fault." He's not happy one bit. And the only reason how Bismarck is actually able to convince him that this is a good idea is effectively he's arguing the same point again. This will be an extension of Prussian power. Don't worry, I'll handle the whole thing. You can continue being the Prussian king, and I'll, take care of German affairs. But it's worth saying that the German state is once again not a product of the Prussian elite or of the aristocracy in any of the other German lands. They're all very, very reluctant and sort of get badgered into this. Nonetheless, when you look at the ceremony of the declaration of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on the 18th of January 1871, you'd see that there's not a civilian in sight. This is entirely a show for the German princes, who are all stood there behind Bismarck, hailing the sort of newly appointed Kaiser. And it's to reassure them. Bismarck kind of, sets the whole thing up to reassure them that this doesn't mean that they'll lose power. This will mean that they gain power, and he has to set it up in that particular way. But once again, the fact that the German nation is actually founded in the heart of another. So the fact that they go into the defeated nation of France, right into the center of it, and declare Germany there, I think is quite telling in terms of, what this unity was founded on. Bismarck reigns Germany under this sort of maxim that has often been attributed to him: laws are like sausages, it's better not to see them being made. And that sums Bismarck up in a nutshell. He's the arch real politician, and in many ways, again, people have used that to argue, okay, here we have an arch conservative chancellor who's cracking the whip in parliament and gets his own way. And yes, Bismarck is a bully, and he is to some extent a nepotist. He installs his own son as a foreign minister, for example, is very much a control freak. Nobody's allowed to do anything unless they kind of check that prior, to implementation with him. But on the flip side, you've also got a very, very confident parliament, full of liberals. National liberals win the first election and fill a third of the seats by themselves. Increasingly also social democrats in there throughout this time frame. There by 1912, they're the largest party in the Reichstag. And when you look at the parliament building, the Reichstag building, which is finished in 1894, you can see that there isn't this isn't the building of a group of people that are cowed or are seeing themselves as a kind of inferior group in the constitution. This is the building of a proud and confident parliament. And I think that is something that's often underestimated because it fails so quickly in 1914. People see it as an inevitable thing that parliament was sort of never strong enough to stand its own against Bismarck and Wilhelm. But even if you look at Bismarck's policies, yes, there is a very strong repression of social democracy, and you do have the anti-socialist laws. But on the flip side, there's also a very, very modern welfare state being set up with pensions, with accident insurance, and all sorts of other things that are very radical given the time frame that he's implementing them in. the three Kaiser year of, this is again a Bismarck quote, I love this one as well. I've seen the three emperors in their nakedness and the sight was not inspiring. So this kind of famous year of 1888, the three Kaiser year, again is worth saying, yes, you do have the accession of Wilhelm II in that year, but you've also got his father, Frederick III, and his liberal English wife, Vicky, who's Queen Victoria's oldest daughter. And both of them thought that they stood a genuine chance to make a new, more liberal Germany out of the one that they found. So in many ways, yes, you know, obviously Frederick can't do much given that he can't even speak during his reign. He's got throat cancer at that point, and dies 100 days into his, or 99 days into his reign. But nonetheless, both of them genuinely believed that there was room for liberalism in Germany and Germany could be reformed. There wasn't that defeatism that, you know, as historians, we're often inclined to sort of see the German Empire with today. But then, of course, Wilhelm II takes over, and here you can see him with Bismarck, and the Reichshund, Tyras, who there's an interesting story around him, which I will not go into any further at this point. But basically, they initially have this kind of mentor-student relationship, or at least Bismarck imagined that they would do, given that he had been a little bit of a father figure to Wilhelm. But Wilhelm quickly proves to be sort of his own man, for better or worse, and Bismarck is forced to resign in 1890. I think, you know, again, Bismarck got it spot on here. The Kaiser is like a balloon. You have to hold tight to the string, or you never know where he'll be off to next. You know, this kind of sums Wilhelm up in a nutshell. And again, he's a much more ambivalent figure, I think, than people have made him out to be. Yes, there is that, you know, militaristic side in him, but there's also a side where, you know, he's a very complex character. He is that balloon that sort of Bismarck made him out to be, in the sense that his mind goes off in different directions. He loves technology, for example, and furthers that hugely. But then on the other hand, that also includes military technology. And of course, most famously, you know, naval advancements, which he furthers with a passion at the detriment of international relations. And hence then also, you know, there's this whole idea of Wilhelm as a militaristic leader is of course correct, but on the flip side, you also have this kind of progress optimism that he brings to the table as well. And that really does characterize the whole of Germany at this point. Everybody believes, because the economy is booming, they're making technological progress, and their Kaiser, as a new young Kaiser, he's only 27 when he comes to the throne, seems to embody that. There's also this kind of almost romantic side to Wilhelm as well. So his bosom buddy here, as you know, for better or worse, basically Eulenburg, Philip to Eulenburg, was seen as. He you know, is a really close friend of Wilhelm's, writes poetry with them. They sing songs together, and this sort of almost like a retreat for Wilhelm until a homosexuality scandal involves Eulenburg, or kind of targets Eulenburg, and Wilhelm has to distance himself from him. And it's that actually that drives him into the arms of the military. Having lost this group of friends, which he now, you know, has to abandon because of the scandal around this, he's got nobody left. His father is dead, his grandfather is dead at that point. And, you know, it's the militaries that are waiting at court, where he's basically isolated. But then, of course, the First World War really does define the Second Empire and the way that or the German Empire, the way that we see it. So Bismarck already once again foresaw this. Obviously, in the 1880s, he said this quote: "One day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans," and he was, of course, right. But again, I just want to point out that even after Franz Ferdinand was shot on the 28th of June 1914, Wilhelm still thinks this is going to be a relatively small-scale war, and actually sets off with his Dachshunds and all, you know, on a holiday cruise, and off he goes for weeks. You know, throughout most of July, he isn't actually in the country. You can again see that, you know, this isn't really a sign that he knew that a large-scale war was on the cards and had triggered this. What he wanted was a small war to see what his military, what his navy could do, and, you know, to sort of further German nationalism. And you can still see that when he comes back and war is declared on Russia and France, and in return Germany receives the war declaration from Britain on the 4th of August, that his first instinct is to go to his people, to go to Parliament and say, you know, I'm your Kaiser now, let's forget about all of our differences. I know no more political parties, he famously says. I only know Germans, and thinks that this is the great moment to rally Germans together. And ironically, of course, as I was saying at the beginning, that turns out to be too much blood and iron for the German Empire to take. And it's also the very same German people that rally behind them in 1914 that bring him down in 1918. But once again, that German Revolution that brings down the empire is almost seen in context of what follows. So nobody or few people stop to see here, you know, where do these social democrats and the liberals that are on the streets come from? Where do they take their ideology from? All of that is a long process that develops throughout the empire. On the eve of the First World War, there's already 3 million trade union members. The SPD are the largest social democratic party in the whole of Europe. And yes, they kind of joined the Kaiser in 1914, but it's a temporary truce. And that's the anomaly, not, you know, what happens afterwards. And that, of course, brings the empire and its Kaiser to an end, and Wilhelm and his son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm, have to cross the River Rhine and spend the rest of their days in Holland, or at least the Kaiser has to. Yes, so just to wrap this up, I think this dualism of liberal democratic tendencies and kind of this, yes, this Prussian militarism is there and seeps into Germany, I think needs to be highlighted, and that's what I was trying to do with this book. It's quite remarkable how much Germany, I think, still shies away from that. The fact that this is 150 years this year since the foundation of the modern German nation state, and yet there's so little mention of that in Germany, in German museums, universities, and elsewhere. If at all, there are kind of memorial celebrations, or not celebrations, but events around the Franco-Prussian War as an event, but not so much around, you know, what actually came from 1871. And I think it's worth giving that empire its own stage, if you will, to investigate it in its own right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katja. Now I'll invite Giles to join the discussion.
Thank you. Yes, Katja, I read your book with great interest and great pleasure, I must say, because I've been cast as an apologist for William, or Wilhelm, or whatever you want to call him. His own family called him, well, at least half his family called him William, which may actually point to one of the big problems about Wilhelm / William, is that he didn't, half the time, he didn't know whether he was meant to be a Prussian or he was meant to be an Englishman. You know, he wanted to be an Englishman half the time, and he wanted to be a Prussian for the other half of the time, and that, of course, caused some of the problems that he had in his own head. He had quite a lot of them. Having been cast as an apologist for William, I think that that's probably unfair, but on the other hand, what I would like to say, and have always maintained, is that we need to see the Second Empire, and we need to see William's reign as in a slightly fairer way than we probably do now. And there are many reasons why we don't look at it in a particularly fair way. But I think in a series of questions, the first question I would always ask was, how and in what way is Germany excluded, and should it be excluded, from the same sort of responsibilities facing other European powers in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century? We make a big thing about empire, the fact that Germany starts to desire a place in the sun, and yet Belgium and France and Britain, and indeed Italy, are all achieving that imperial status at the time. The desire to acquire a navy, which you bring out terribly well in your book, in his reading of this American naval scholar whom he virtually worshipped at the time. The desire to keep a navy in order to maintain a colonial trade was not so far-fetched, and yet the British arguments are always maintained, yes, but it was facing us across the North Sea, it was an impertinence to build the navy. These arguments, perhaps in objective terms, don't look quite fair, do they? If Germany is to be compared with any other country in the late 19th century, it's probably Italy. And perhaps that comparison between Piemonte or Savoy, which unifies Italy, and Prussia, which unifies Germany, is an interesting comparison to make. I mean, I think only of the leopard, of Il Gattopardo, that the Sicilian who's faced with these Piemontese civil servants who come down and visit him and want to impose their North Italian way of life on these bandit-like princes in Sicily, and is virtually laughed away by the sons of the prince because this is an absurd idea as far as they're concerned, to resemble people in Milan. Now, Germany is perhaps not quite so diverse as Italy is, but that comparison can be a rewarding one, I think, in terms of understanding a newly unified state which is trying to catch up with its neighbors in Europe. The other aspects, I'd say, that, as you rightly point out, that Germany develops a very solid parliamentary government, admittedly with this famous 3 voting systems, which don't allow the ordinary voter really to have much power to do anything.
That's specific to Prussia, though. So the yes. Overall federal parliament is elected by universal male suffrage.
But Prussia represents 3/5 of Germany, so it's still a big weight, isn't it, within Germany? But that being said, you're looking once again at this idea of objectivity with all writing about Germany. I mean, you have pointed out that even now, in the 150th anniversary of the creation of Germany in 1871, we're still looking at what we might call the course of German history. We can't get away from what happened after 1914, or indeed after 1933. And where I think my plea for fairness would lie would be in, as you say in your book, you cannot predict in 1871, indeed, or even in 1914, or even in 1918, that the events that take place from 1933 onwards are necessarily going to happen. And yet, during the Second World War, there was an absolute industry going on in this country and in the United States, plotting a sort of graph that began with Tacitus, and Tacitus's characterization of the German barbarians, and plotting this graph all the way to Hitler, without any sort of intervening periods of calmness or reasonableness or anything else. Naturally Germany was going to go in that direction, and there was no stopping it. So we've had this habit, I think, of looking through the wrong end of the telescope of Germany and deciding that what Germany becomes in 1933 is inevitable. And I think that any form of historiography that can in some way correct that view, that it is not an inevitable thing that Germany becomes what it is in 1933, has to be welcomed. And I congratulate you on putting forward this view in your book so fairly and so succinctly, and with great readability, which I found the book a delight to read. So thank you.
I think one of the problems that we've had is that a lot of the historiography that we see now still stems from traditions that were set up straight after the Second World War, where people were effectively looking at the catastrophe that war was, with its 50 million casualties, and the Holocaust had to be explained, and people were desperately looking for explanations for that. And of course, then, you know, given that the First World War was only a generation away, really, people like Fritz Fischer come onto the scene and sort of try and draw a line between the two. And you end up effectively with a situation that makes it easier to explain it as a kind of natural German thing that's always been there, and therefore, you know, it naturally had to lead, once the technology and once the kind of cultural excesses had led to those problems kind of escalating, it naturally had to get to that point. And that makes it easier to explain it. It absolves an awful lot of people of a lot of responsibility when you think about it. It takes all the action, the decisions that were made in between those two wars, but also in the build up to the First World War and during the First World War, completely out of the picture, because it makes everyone part of this kind of tide of history that they couldn't escape. So I think that's a problem, and I'm hoping that, you know, given that we're now 75 years away from that, that there might be a chance now to perhaps take a step back and look at the historiography of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and take that on board, that they were still in that sort of cultural world that they were in, and perhaps, you know, take a step back from that and look again at things that happened earlier, rather than just relying on those traditions that were set up. And the other thing is, I think, because there's this obsession about German history, I think specifically in Britain, obsession both positive and negative. I think there's always been a fascination with German history, I think, here. Where when you take things like the naval buildup, for example, just the thought of German ships, you know, going out of German ports, they have to go through the Channel or through the North Sea, and they're literally within, you know, viewing distance of British ports. When you compare that to Italy, you know, okay, it's a bit, you know, look at Mussolini's empire building, say, in Africa. Okay, you know, people condemn that, and people look at the poison gas attacks in Ethiopia and things like that and condemn it, but it's never with the same like sense of dread or doom almost, you know, that kind of German shipbuilding is viewed at, because the ships go straight into the Mediterranean and are sort of out of sight, as it were. So I think there's that as well. And then, of course, the traditional, as Bismarck called it, hereditary enmity, if you will, with, you know, between France and Germany. I think there's that shadow always there as well. Is a unified Germany per se a threat to the European balance of power and to European peace, or does Germany have to be, you know, sort of as per EU, basically built into a framework that keeps it, you know, peaceful and at balance with the other nations? So I think Germany has got a special place within the European psyche, simply because it's a relatively new nation that has caused such havoc since it's emerged, and I think that's never really gone away. And the question is, can we move away from that? Slowly but surely, I think.
We did see a little bit with the 100th anniversary at the beginning of the First World War in 2014. We saw quite a lot of historians coming round and producing their take on just who started the First World War again. So we went and revisited all this very negative blaming that took place in the 1920s in the wake of the Treaty of Versailles, the desire to find someone to blame for the bloodshed and for to pay for the bloodshed and to pay for everything else, and that in some ways Germany becomes, because Austria has been more or less robbed of everything that Austria had before 1914. The fact that it started with with the killing of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand seems to have been lost in the process of the busyness of wanting to blame Germany for the whole build-up, or for what happened, or the Kaiser was plotting very much from the beginning. As you say in the book, the Kaiser went off on his holiday and appears at various times to be very, very reasonable about what he demands from his Nibelung loyalty with Franz Joseph in Austria. You know, actually telling the Austrians, well, I can't see that you've got anything to complain about now. They've said sorry. You know, that's fine, isn't it? So the Kaiser is always a problem, because he is liable to say two things that seem apparently contradictory. He shoots his mouth off. Your little quotation about the balloon is excellent there. The Kaiser is not an easy person to interpret because of these ambiguous statements. But I think that a lot of good work did come out in 2014 in actually looking once again at, was it as simple as we interpreted it at the time in 1914, or indeed after the Treaty of Versailles. So I think that is positive, and I think I would like to see more of that coming out now.
I also think that we're again drawn to the First World War, aren't we? And that's kind of the natural thing to do, looking at the last sort of 4 years of the empire and how it was brought down. But I also think just looking at the state that Bismarck actually set up in the first place had both of these elements were remarkably strong in there. So you do have a sense, of course, that Bismarck was trying to preserve Prussian power. It's worth stating that he's not a German nationalist. He did see Germany as an extension of Prussian power, and there's no way of, as much as I admire the man for his political cunning and his policy making, there is also a lot in him that wants to preserve aristocratic power, wants to preserve Prussian power, and this constitution is very much a sign of that. And there's no doubt in my mind as well that he did underestimate the parliament that he created. But when you think how strong the forces had to be for him to even sit there, for somebody that is not a Democrat, not a liberal, to set up a parliament in the first place that's elected by universal male suffrage, which goes way further than most other nations did at the same time. No kind of, for instance, restrictions in terms of wealth or land ownership or status or anything like that. And yes, he does counterbalance that, of course, with the Landtag, which does have with the Bundesrat, which has a lot more kind of social restrictions there, as you were saying, with the 3-tier system in Prussia, for example. But nonetheless, those two elements are worth pointing out, rather than, this was a token state, or as Wilhelm Liebknecht put it, a fig leaf of democracy over the nakedness of despotism. That's not what the Reichstag was. You don't build a monument to democracy like that, when it's nothing. And they were powerful and they were strong and they were providing a counterbalance, which I think you're doing a lot of people a disservice by brushing that aside as a token effort.
Good. So, are we throwing the discussion open?
Yes, I was about to say, thank you both very, very much. I'm going to start with a few questions. So there are already some coming in the Q&A box. Like I said at the beginning, please do submit your questions. But I actually have a question of my own, and this is bringing in the British view as well. So Katja, you say in your book that at the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, the British Foreign Minister, Lord Castlereagh, supported the Prussian plan to acquire the Kingdom of Saxony as, and I quote, "He wished for a unified and reliable German state to take charge of Central Europe and act as a barrier to any future aggression from France." So how did the UK's attitude towards a unified Germany change over the next decades?
Well, there was always this kind of famous desire for a balance of power, really, in Europe. And because of Napoleon, it had become blatantly obvious that a fractured center in Europe is just, from a security point of view, just not a good idea. And so, and as I was saying earlier as well, there were problems with individual states, like the Belgians were constantly rebelling, wanting to have their independence, basically, and there were other smaller states within the German lands as well, which were continuously proving to be a pain for the powers around them. And so the idea was that if you had Prussia, which had hugely impressed Britain during the alliance that they had against Napoleon, both from a military point of view, but also in terms of the extensive administration that they'd built up and the modernism in the state, it had gained huge amounts of respect. And so the idea that you could have a sort of stable, well-organized, well-disciplined center of power in Europe, to see, especially as Napoleon had actually come back, this is something that people were also worried about. It's kind of like, we've done it now, and this could happen at any point in time. That view was still there. And so I don't think that ever really changed until you know, Germany became a threat again with naval policy building up and with aspirations towards empire. There's a reason why Bismarck is so mega cautious with both of those things in the 1870s and the 1880s. He says from the off, we can't have an empire. We need to make it very clear that we are a European power, because otherwise we're going to worry both the British and the French and the Russians to a point where we will not continue to exist. He knows that. And so he spends a lot of time and energy on foreign policy, not only kind of making this, you know, very intricate foreign policy network that he builds up, but also making it clear that Germany has got continental aspirations, not kind of the idea that they're going to be a world empire. So I think the British attitude towards Germany is only changing from the point of where Bismarck kind of leaves, hence the kind of famous dropping of the, you know, pilot cartoon, which is the British view, basically. Oh no, Bismarck as a stabilizing force is going, where's this German ship sailing next, so to speak. I think it's at that point really, which is quite remarkable. So they were virtually, you know, most of the 19th century connections were quite positive, because they're building up economically and politically.
A huge cultural link between Germany and Britain in the late 19th century, an enormous admiration for the sciences in Germany, for philosophy, for historiography even. You know, there was a time in the closing decades of the 19th century when Germany became enormously fashionable intellectually in this country. So, you know, there was that particular interest in the new Germany, but I think also at the bottom end of society, perhaps a little bit like sort of the yellow press or the gutter press was already having a go at the Kaiser because of the Kaiser's relationship with his mother, who was being perceived as an English woman who was being badly treated by her German son. This was slightly changed at the time of the death of Queen Victoria, because Queen Victoria actually died in the Kaiser's arms. And at that time, the Kaiser went through one of the very, very rare periods when he was popular with ordinary Britons, because he'd left the Kaiser's court where they were celebrating the Prussian monarchy's 200th anniversary and came as a simple grandson to his grandmother's bedside. And there was this rare moment when, for a little while at least, the Kaiser was popular in Britain.
The Times actually spoke of your English tears, and actually kind of saw the, you know, the English side in him and highlighted that.
Apologies, I was just muted. I'm now going to start with some of the questions that have come in the Q&A box. So the first question is from Richard Ford. Why did Bismarck refuse to allow William I to annex Bohemia and Moravia after Austria's defeat in the Austro-Prussian War, but allowed the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War?
He was opposed. A good question. He was opposed to both, because he was keenly aware, I think, of the fact that the unification of Germany would throw the power balance completely out of kilter in Central Europe. And so immediately after the war, it's that paradox of, you know, we've just won a war and unified Germany in a warlike fashion, but we're actually a peaceful nation that just wants to live in peace. And he had to convince people of that. So he was against any what he saw as sort of vindictive annexations of territory that isn't naturally within the kind of reach of German nationalism, as it were. The problem with Alsace-Lorraine was that Alsace was almost entirely German, and Lorraine had German-speaking regions. And the German nationalists, like I was just saying earlier, were so powerful that they actually demanded a parliament. Those very same forces were also demanding the unification of all German speakers. And so the pressure on Bismarck was immense, not least from Moltke actually as well, Helmut Moltke the Elder. As much as he had a very keen sense of what was right and what wasn't right militarily speaking, he also insisted that Alsace and Lorraine both needed to be annexed. And given the military brilliance that had just allowed Bismarck, you know, his glorious victory, which enabled unification in the first place, he sort of also felt that he couldn't deny Moltke, and that was another reason. But there were forces outside of Bismarck's own doing. He did predict that this would effectively perpetuate the enmity with France to a point where that could never be repaired until you give Alsace and Lorraine back. So he would have rather sacrificed that personally, but wasn't politically in a position to do so.
Wasn't it also true that Fritz, the Crown Prince, was quite keen on the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine?
Yeah, for the same reason. It's that liberal stream basically that was arguing all German speakers need to be under this, you know, German constitution that was going to be set up.
And the next question is from Harry Reeves. A review of your book in The Spectator said you'd been soft on Bismarck. I think the reviewer misses much of your nuance. To what extent do you think Bismarck has been judged too harshly?
Well, Bismarck's legacy in historiography is an interesting one. I'm East German myself, and when I grew up with history teachers that were sort of trained in East Germany, Honecker had just gone through a phase of like reappraising Prussia, and kind of reinvestigating it and lifting its reputation. So I grew up with history teachers who absolutely loved Bismarck. But then when we revisited that when I was at A-level, sort of 5-6 years later, and history teachers had got round to the idea that they now need to teach West German views, all of a sudden it was, no, he was a militarist from the off, and, you know, all he wanted was power for Prussia and for Germany, and that view was immediately changed around. So I think it depends a bit who you ask on that one. My personal view is, like I said earlier, he's an arch real politician, and whether you can, you know, he's amoral in the actual sense of the word. He doesn't sit there and consider, is this and that a right thing to do? He thinks this needs to be done, so what's the best way to do it? And if that's ugly, you know, like the sausage metaphor that he uses himself, then it's got to be done. And I think it depends on your personal perspective whether or not you deem this completely amoral approach to politics as something that is to be admired for its practicality, or something that is to be condemned for its complete lack of morality. I tend to be, as that Spectator review by James Hawes said, I tend to be more on the former side rather than the latter. I do think he got a lot of progress done against the forces of the time, not because he was a particularly progressive individual, but because he recognized the forces of the time and the zeitgeist of the time was going that way. Whether he did that to preserve, you know, monarchy or not is one thing, but he did do it, and he did allow a degree of democracy into the country. I think that would have otherwise never happened at the same time. So I think he needs to be seen in the context of that. And in that context, he achieved a lot against a lot of opposition. Holding the country alone together, I think that in itself is an admirable feat, really, given that nobody had managed that virtually, you know, for, well, forever, really. He created that state, held it together, and it was still there after the First World War.
And we have some further questions. Another question from Richard Ford. Why did Bismarck want to exclude the Austrian half of the dual monarchy from Germany, the so-called Kleindeutsche Lösung?
Much to do with that dualism I was pointing out earlier. So the fact that Austria and Prussia had completely begun to sort of go their separate ways after 1815, both in terms of economic developments, but also just culturally as well, given that they're Catholic, and Bismarck and Wilhelm are setting up a kind of arch-Prussian state, and bear in mind as well, arch-Protestant state, and bear in mind as well that the Protestantism of Prussia is a really deep-seated thing. It's not, I mean, I don't want to, you know, like talk about Anglicanism as a, you know, I don't want to brush that aside, but the fact that Anglicanism has got other different ideological basis and can actually live with things like, say, an internal hierarchy, and kind of is a bit more fluid in terms of the concepts that underpin it. The Protestantism that takes hold in Prussia is very, very deep-seated and has got this whole discipline, vocation, you know, law and order kind of stuff with it. And so culturally it has a huge impact over the people in Prussia, and they were just drifting apart further and further. Neither did the Austrians accept that there was going to be a Prussian, you know, overlordship over, or they wouldn't have accepted that over an all-German solution. And I think that, you know, was recognized by all sides, and that conflict was solved with the so-called Brothers' War, with that German war between Austria and Prussia. I don't know, Giles, if you got a more kind of Central European, I guess, view on that.
Well, not particularly. No, I think that's fine. I mean, obviously, Bismarck, as you say, the real politician, the absorbing of a country that is perceived as having its interests lying to the east of it, towards in countries which do not speak German, and therefore you would have to absorb Austria with a lot of other things as well. You know, the problem, I think actually Hitler says in Mein Kampf, the problem with Austria is that it's a dynastic country. It is not a country based on anything other than its monarchy. And it's its monarchy that binds it together, and therefore you have all these subject people speaking different languages. It would have been very, very difficult to create a realistic state in which Austria had a foot in that German-speaking country and another foot in its multinational empire.
We have loads of questions coming through, and unfortunately only 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to speed through these. So one more question by Simon Davis. A great talk, thank you. How prominent was the German general staff during this period, and how would you characterize their role?
I would say, well, initially they were very conscious, like I was saying about Moltke as well, of the fact that they carried that German unification process through, and therefore insisted that they have to have a special role within the state. So they existed outside of the constitution, completely outside of it, with the only binding, or the only two binding factors, that was that the Reichstag had financial hold over the army, so they were basically budgeting it. And the Kaiser was the highest military authority as commander-in-chief. But other than that, they completely stood outside of the state. There's this famous incident of the Saarbrunn affair, where basically the military in the Saarbrunn region behave appallingly, and the Reichstag is up in arms about it, and Wilhelm just stands there, shrugs his shoulders and goes, "What you want me to do? It's the army, they do what they want." And so there is this sense, you know, from the general staff certainly, that they sit outside of the constitutional realm, and to some extent also outside of the Kaiser's reach.
Yes, and what's more, they do, and this is go back to Fischer, and back to that negative historiography, but where Fischer's books are so interesting is just how big business gets together with the general staff, and how very much they're in one another's pockets to some extent, with the so-called Siegfried solution, which is that you can get away from granting more liberties to the people, or greater democracy, or giving in to the socialists, if you can go off and conquer more land. Whether the Kaiser is with it or not with it is a question of interpretation, probably not so much. But on the other hand, they were extremely powerful, and once the war started, they achieved almost total power, and therefore this machine went off by itself.
I'm going to try and fit in two more questions. So one here is Nicholas Wagner. You mentioned that Germany does not play a very active role in memorializing the 1871 to 1914 period. Do you think that this is due to this period specifically, e.g. Bismarck's militarism, or is it part of a wider German overcoming of history, such as after the Second World War?
I think I mentioned somewhere recently in an essay that I see the Second World War as a bit of a historical black hole that sort of sucks everything into its orbit, what happened before and after. And I think in Germany that's particularly true. I think there's been so much focus on getting through the Holocaust and the Second World War and Nazism and dealing with that over and over again, that I think anything that happened before it has almost fallen, I wouldn't say by the wayside, but it's difficult to deal with because, you know, on the one hand side, you can't ignore what happened afterwards, but on the other side, you know, people also feel that you can't take, say, curriculum time or attention away from the Second World War. And so I think that there is a little bit of both of those things. It's difficult to deal with, and it's deemed to be, I think, in my opinion, it's deemed to be less important still in Germany than dealing with what came after.
So last question from Nick Glanville. Thank you for your very interesting talk. There's been more academic and public attention in recent years on the German colonial empire, including on the genocide of the Herero and Nama people. I'd be interested in any reflections you have on this from your research, including your view on the extent to which the colonial empire touched the lives of ordinary Germans.
Well, I think to some extent what Giles was saying earlier about kind of using foreign conquest as a means of unifying the German people themselves, that goes for the empire as well. The German people absolutely loved it. They were completely enthralled with it. So you had these little like colonial wear shops, they were called, and people still call them that now, by the way, like corner shops basically are still sometimes called colonial wear shops or colonial shops. Where you could get like tinned pineapple and dried coconut and stuff like, and coffee and tea and sugar and all of those things. And people were just walking in there and they had all of these evocative labels with palm trees on them and whatever. People just had this idea that those were like exotic places where adventure happened. And, they never really, I think, fully appreciated the crimes that were committed there until the Herero uprisings happened and were raised by parliament. Once again, the Social Democrats and the Liberals were absolutely up in arms about them and said something needed to happen and refused to pass a military budget to deal with those uprisings and to provide the forces to deal with them, which in the end had to basically end up in new elections in I think it's 1907, I want to say, 8. When basically that became a political issue as well in the empire, where the left was certainly becoming increasingly outspoken. But on the whole, most Germans, including the working classes, had a kind of a special place in their imagination for the empire and saw it as a positive thing.
Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time. So let me please thank you, Katja and Giles, for joining us this evening. And thank you to everyone in the audience for taking part. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but it was great that you could attend, and keep those in mind for an upcoming event. So yes, thank you again very much for joining us, and we'll keep you posted on any upcoming BGA events, so keep an eye on your email. Thank you both again for joining.
Thank you for hosting this. It's been great questions as well. So really enjoyed it.